Good evening. I hope everyone's Palm Sunday celebration was inspiring and that Holy Week has begun in a meaningful way as we move closer to Easter. Welcome to the April session of the APP Speaker Series, which happens tonight, Holy Tuesday, April 4th, 2023. I'm your host for the evening, Reverend Rebecca Marr Cardis. Tonight's presentation, After Palm Sunday, Public Liturgy and Liberation by Ched Myers, an activist theologian, is sponsored by the Association of Pittsburgh Priests, an organization grounded in the gospel of Jesus and led by the spirit of Vatican II to spread the good news of God's love to the Pittsburgh area and beyond.
This is my first direct contact with all of y'all. Most of the people on the screen here I don't know, although there are a few old friends who I see. We are separated by just a few degrees. I know many Catholic workers and peace activists in your wider APP community, not least distinguished daughter of Pennsylvania, Molly Rush, and of course, the longstanding work of the Merton Center that she and you co-founded. For almost 60 years, you all at the APP have been a beacon in the fog of those trying to minimize and marginalize Vatican II's vision for the Catholic Church. So I really am grateful for the invitation to be part of your ongoing clarification of thought sessions and to talk with you tonight about the meaning of Palm Sunday. I'm beaming to you from the Ventura River watershed in Southern California, the heart of unceded and untreated Chumash territory, where land and people bear the marks of colonial genocide and continuing social and racial disparity. As settlers here, we pursue a gospel vocation of nurturing beloved community and sustainable just lifeways amidst multiple interlocking social and ecological crises, as do you all in the APP in the Pittsburgh bioregion. 2 days ago, Palm Sunday once again launched us into Holy Week 2023. So it's a good time to reflect on the roots of a liturgical tradition that has, frankly, deteriorated into all too rote of a ritual for many Christians. In most North American churches, Palm Sunday occasions a pious procession around the sanctuary with cute children waving palm fronds. While at least this gets folk up out of their pews, is pretty sentimentalized, as if the gospel story took place in Disneyland. My title tonight, After Palm Sunday, is a kind of a triple entendre. First, we'll read Jesus' public action through the lens of its political consequences, that is, what happened after the march. Second, it acknowledges that we all read this story long after that event took place in that world, and our task is to discern its meaning for our discipleship today in our context. And third, we'll take this occasion to commemorate the martyrdom of our nation's greatest prophet 55 years ago, because Palm Sunday 1968 happened just 3 days after King was killed. My strategy tonight is to challenge us to replace the story of Palm Sunday in its real world landscape in order to understand the liturgical politics of Jesus then and now. Even though we are in year A of the lectionary, which is why you heard Matthew's account of the Palm Sunday story in Sunday Mass, we'll look tonight at Luke's telling of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, since it's the longest of our synoptic versions. We're going to do a bit of serious scripture study tonight, so you might want to have a Bible at hand and a notepad. Your own Father Neil Macaulay would approve, I think, as Art McDonald noted in his recent history of the Association of Pittsburgh Priests, which John was kind enough to send me. Macaulay saw how Vatican II inspired, quote, an enormous increase in Catholic exposure to scripture, an emphasis on biblical spirituality, and more biblical preaching in the church. Similarly, I believe the old wisdom of scripture can help kickstart our theological and political imaginations as we struggle to engage our profoundly fraught historical moment. And for those of us trying to nurture activist engagement by our churches, Scripture can and should do the heavy lifting as the sacred stories at the radical roots of our faith. So let's begin with a few quick notes about how Luke's Palm Sunday episode fits into his wider gospel narrative. All stories are scaffolded on two things: plot and structure. Let's start with Luke's plot. The second half of the overall narrative of Luke traces Jesus' journey from Galilee steadily south to the capital city for his final showdown with the powers, moving from the margins of Palestinian society to its center. This plot functions to illustrate how and why Jesus' ministry was perceived as so subversive by the local imperial authorities of occupied Palestine that they felt compelled to execute him. As you see here, this narrative arc begins with a dramatic turn in chapter 9 in which Jesus sets his face toward Jerusalem, and culminates in chapter 19 on the outskirts of Jerusalem, where Jesus offers a dark parable about the cost of discipleship for anyone who would resist an oppressive system. This plot culminates with a narrative sequence that takes Jesus into Jerusalem in chapter 19. Let's take a closer look. You may recall that this parable of the pounds, or minas, a large measure of currency handled only by banks and states, is a story about an absentee king. As such, it is a kind of political parody of Herod Antipas, the autocrat ruling northern Palestine at the time of Jesus. We might say that this character is a kind of Trumpian. Yeah, that guy's in the news again today. The wealthy tyrant commissions and then settles accounts with three managers doing his bidding in the political economy he controls. And of course, as you know, the third one he fires. The first two, whom the plutocrat deals with, he rewards handsomely because they cooperate with his schemes to concentrate wealth in the hands of the elite. As the king puts it, to all those who have, more will be given, and from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. That's a pretty depressing view of society. But this tyrant viciously punishes the third manager because he refuses to play the game of usury-driven profit. The parable is, in other words, a warning tale about how resistance to the dominant system will inevitably result in a fatal clash with the authorities. In the first instance, of course, this parable is a kind of reality check on the immediately preceding story of Zacchaeus. This remarkable episode depicts someone high in the economic hierarchy who nevertheless decides to follow Jesus and who dramatically defects by redistributing his fraudulently acquired wealth. Jesus warns his listeners not to equate Zacchaeus' repentance with the dawn of the kingdom of God. However, people may change, but oppressive systems must still be overturned. And in that vein, the parable's concluding violence in verse 27 suggests that this tale is also a thinly veiled autobiography in which Jesus portends his own fate. Like the third servant in the parable, Jesus too will ultimately be labeled an enemy of the status quo and publicly executed. Indeed, the parable ends with a transitional statement. After he had said this, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. And we all know what happens to him there. So let's now step back and look at the structure of the rest of the sequence that now follows. The parable offers a sobering economic analysis of a cruel economic system. It is followed immediately by Jesus' march into the holy city. Then his poignant lament over that city. The sequence then culminates in Jesus' entry into the temple for a dramatic direct action against profiteering banking interests. Tonight, we'll focus on the march into Jerusalem, but I think it's important to see how each of these four episodes deepens Luke's plot, making it clear why Jesus is a marked man. Note particularly the resonance between the two framing episodes, the parable of the pounds and the cleansing of the temple. Both indicate that Jesus is moving from critical reflection to direct action, from pedagogy to practice. So let's pick up the narrative that the church commemorates as Palm Sunday at Luke 19:28. Jesus is approaching from Jericho to the east, where he had encountered Zacchaeus. He arrives at the village of Bethany, about 1.5 miles east of Jerusalem, and there he prepares to enter the holy city. But Jesus comes not as a reverent pilgrim, demonstrating his allegiance to the temple state. Rather, he enters as a prophet, challenging the foundations of state power. In fact, Jesus' so-called triumphal entry into Jerusalem is something of a misnomer for several reasons. For one, Luke's version of the story omits the hosannas and the palms, suggesting that these are actually not the most important parts of the parade, even though that's what we modern Christians tend to focus on. For another, this carefully choreographed public demonstration is designed to repudiate messianic triumphalism. Let's take a careful look. Two things to note about Jesus' approach. First, the setting. Jesus goes up the far side of the Mount of Olives, verse 29. The village of Bethphage is thought to have been located on its southeastern slope. Then a few verses later, he descends on the Jerusalem side. This detailed focus on his itinerary functions to center the focus on the Mount of Olives, an important feature in Jerusalem's landscape, both topographically and geopolitically. From the 3rd millennium before the Common Era until the present day, this 3,000-foot hill has served as one of the main burial grounds for the city, so it's covered with graves. This setting is highly symbolic and would have brought to mind to biblically literate readers not one but two oracles from the prophet Zechariah. To launch a procession from the Mount of Olives alludes to the final apocalyptic battle between Israel and her enemies spoken of in Zechariah 14, 1-5. Such an insinuation would have heightened the political tensions of the parade to come by invoking Judean hopes that their God would finally come and liberate them from their enemies. And Israel's enemy in the first century was the occupying Roman army. The rule of the empire was absolute, not least in Palestine, where heavily armed legions kept things locked down, especially in Jerusalem. This 3rd century of the Common Era legionnaire dedication plaque comes from a different periphery of the Roman Empire in northern England. The inscription is flanked by relief carvings. At left, Mars, the Roman god of war, brandishes a spear, while at right, the mythological hero Hercules holds his club. The message of this propaganda is clear. Don't mess with the empire, because we will beat you down. But there's more. Well over half of Luke's plot narrative from here is devoted to these strange instructions that you see here given by Jesus to two disciples to procure him a mount. These instructions are sandwiched in between his trip up and down the Mount of Olives. We have here uncharacteristic detail and repetition. The entire scenario is repeated twice. This gives the distinct impression that everything is being deliberately choreographed. It might even imply some sort of street code being used by Jesus' movement. This strengthens my contention that the march to come is intentionally and strategically planned political street theater. The donkey encodes a second concerning how the great apocalyptic battle will be waged against Israel's enemies. In Zechariah 9:8, God promises to end to oppression for his people. I will encamp in my house against armies, and no oppressor will ever overrun them again. Good news indeed. But what sort of encampment? The next verse famously introduces a messianic leader mounted not on a war horse, but humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Now you see the symbolics that Jesus is carefully curating for this march. Moreover, a third verse envisions an end to all violence and war. More good news. So if the stage of the Mount of Olives signaled a final struggle, the Zechariah donkey functions to undermine any military fantasies that Luke's readers may have harbored. Repetition being the key to pedagogy, Luke keeps repeating the instructions so we readers understand that the disciples have gone to great lengths to procure this donkey as the central prop of Jesus' street theater. Pretty genius, eh? But this nonviolent symbolism doesn't lessen the thoroughly political nature of the parade that now commences. Each detail in Luke's account invokes more memories of Israelite sovereignty. For example, people laying their garments on the road would have recalled the insurgent declaration of Jehu as an upstart Israelite king in 2 Kings 9, many centuries before. The donkey also signifies the ancient triumph of the tribe of Judah in Genesis 49:11. So this colt is not just a ride for Jesus. It represents a symbolic fulfillment of the ancient Israelite dreams of freedom. And so it is tantamount to a declaration of independence. That's pretty powerful street theater in an occupied country, locked down by an empire whose coins boasted that its hegemony was eternal. Luke engages this world narrative, one that is neither fairy tale nor cosmic drama playing out in our spirits apart from human history, but rather an engaged protest that brings hope under the shadow of violence, domination, and uncertainty. The world was held not in the hands of the Eternitas, as you see on the coin, but by Yahweh. Perhaps an analogy to Palm Sunday's subversive theater will help us here. Say the Boston Tea Party of 1773. This was a clearly symbolic action by American colonists who sought to address both a specific tax that was economically odious to them and the broader political question of overseas rule. This public theater had costuming too. The Sons of Liberty, as they called themselves, wore face paint and dressed up as Mohawk warriors. This was meant to show that they identified as Americans rather than as subjects of Great Britain. Pretty ironic, given that these same settlers would soon go to war against the real Mohawk Confederacy in the ongoing colonial project of disposing First Nations across Turtle Island. That, of course, is a whole nother story, although it does give me the opportunity at this midpoint to shamelessly plug Elaine and my most recent book that outlines a discipleship of decolonization for us settler Christians who are trying to reckon with the legacy of displacement and genocide of Indigenous peoples in every corner of our continent, including central Pennsylvania. You can find the book at healinghauntedhistories.org, and we hope some of you might want to work through this material that is pressing so urgently on our historical moment, particularly with the Pope's repudiation this week of the doctrine of discovery. But back to Luke. If the donkey and cloaks weren't enough, the chants that arise from the growing crowd as Jesus descends the Mount of Olives intensifies this parade as political theater. These shouts echo the royal procession and coronation hymn of Psalm 118, further underlining the political crisis over Israelite sovereignty in Jesus' time. But they also allude to more recent events. They recall the victorious military procession of Simon Maccabeus, the guerrilla Jewish general who had liberated Palestine from Hellenistic rule just 2 centuries before Luke is writing. According to 1 Maccabees 13, Simon entered Jerusalem with praise and palm branches and with hymns and songs. Sound familiar? On top of that, there had been an incident of messianic posturing at the beginning of the Judean revolt against Rome, only a generation before Luke wrote. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, the guerrilla captain Menachem had marched through Jesus heavily armed and like a king in an unsuccessful attempt to become the sole leader of the Judean provisional government. Now, I know this is a lot of historic detail, but remember, friends, we're trying to replace the gospel stories in real life to rescue them from Disneyland. And uprisings like these would have long lingered in the memory of Jesus' people, just like we still celebrate Independence Day in our country. It's not unlike how we activists still invoke, for example, the life and work of people like my dear mentors Philip and Daniel Berrigan in their war resistance, or Martin Luther King at the Lincoln Memorial invoking God's dream of justice, or further back, Mother Jones leading labor strikes during the Gilded Era, or further back still, Harriet Tubman facilitating the Underground Railroad carrying enslaved persons to freedom under American apartheid. But wait, there's more. The crowd's declaration of peace in heaven and glory in the highest represents a direct challenge to the Roman imperial mythos. It was customary for Roman media to declare peace and prosperity at the birth of someone who was to become emperor. Remember, this is exactly the same phrase that the angels proclaimed to the peasant shepherds at the very beginning of Luke's story. It articulates a clear defiance of Roman propaganda, because it's not the Pax Romana being proclaimed at the Nativity, nor in this Palm Sunday parade. Rather, it is a decidedly messianic vision of sovereignty. And such loaded rhetoric would not have been lost on either the Jewish or the Roman authorities. To underline the conflict, consider what Marcus Borg and Dom Crossan contend in their 2006 book, The Last Week, a day-to-day account of Jesus' final week. They argue that there were likely two processions into Jerusalem during that Passover. The high holy days were always a potentially volatile time in Jerusalem, since Jews were celebrating their deliverance from an older empire in Egypt, even as they were enduring the Roman boot. The occupiers knew that nationalist Jews would get all riled up during Passover's talk about freedom from bondage. So, as Jesus was entering the city from the east, a military cavalry led by the Roman governor Pilate may well have been arriving in the city from the west, bringing troops and reinforcements to quell any overzealous Jews who might try to call for revolt. Such Roman military processions were also very much political theater. The Triumphus, for example, was a public celebration of military victories of the empire in which the general wore regalia that identified him as near divine and rode in a chariot through the streets of Rome in procession with his army and the spoils of war. It is this spectacle of imperial domination that the writer of Colossians later parodies, portraying instead the risen Christ publicly parading the principalities and powers who have been defeated by the cross, a deeply ironic and subversive image. A depiction of a military march is still visible today in Rome on the ruins of the Arch of Titus. It was constructed in 82 of the Common Era, roughly contemporaneous with the Gospel of Luke, by the Emperor Domitian to commemorate Titus' victories, including his siege of Jerusalem a decade earlier. Another panel on the same arch shows Roman soldiers marching into the city with their spoils, including all the riches from the sacked Jewish temple in Jerusalem. Notice the giant menorah. Obviously, for late first century Jews, these were monuments to terror and to trauma. So make no mistake, Roman soldiers marching into West Jerusalem during Passover was a show of force meant to intimidate any opposition to their colonial project. And let us not forget that today, these things continue to occur in that very city, as Israeli defense forces seek to intimidate dissent from Palestinians with tragic consequences. In light of all this, we must conclude that Jesus was staging a kind of counter demonstration. Pilate rides into Jerusalem on a war horse, threatening beatdown. Jesus on a borrowed donkey, offering liberation. The procurator claims the Pax Romana, the Nazarene a Pax Christi. Jesus rides an animal who symbolized sovereignty, but also the prophetic promise that Yahweh would one day banish the war horse forever. Pretty subversive stuff. No wonder then that some of the local Judean authorities try to silence the crowds, wishing to avoid an imperial lockdown. How often in the history of our churches have cautious or conservative leaders tried to suppress among the marginalized, and the crowds get a little riled up because of injustice. Jesus' retort to the authorities, on the other hand, is sharp and pointed. The image of stones crying out is citing an oracle from yet another prophet. Habakkuk 2 critiques elites who built fortress-like trophy homes on the backs of oppressed laborers, a strategy, by the way, of the super rich that frankly hasn't changed much. But the ancient prophet intones, the very walls of such homes cry out against them, alluding to the cry of the oppressed that Yahweh heard at the beginning of the Exodus story, that famous moment in Exodus 3 at the burning bush, which launched the Bible's entire narrative of liberation. Jesus, in other words, is refusing to control or contain the popular resurgence of hope roiling around him during this procession. Let our churches be clear that the Jesus of our Gospels marches with poor and marginalized people in the streets, in the tradition of prophetic faith. No matter how much politicians and priests then and now criticize and even demonize protesters from their insular offices and pulpits and Mar-Lagos. Hanging prominently in our office here at Bartimaeus Cooperative Ministries is a poster of Belgian artist James Ensor's The Entry of Christ into Brussels in 1889. This 1888 painting imagined an imminent anarcho-socialist uprising portrayed in a scene so chaotic and carnivalesque that it's hard to even see Christ figure at its center. This piece was so controversial at the time that it wasn't exhibited until 30 years later. But I like it because it captures the energy of our gospel story, through which Luke sought to express prophetic hopes for justice amidst militarized repression and circus politics in first century Jerusalem. Luke's account of the Palm Sunday demonstration makes clear why Jesus was such a threat to the colonized status quo of occupied Palestine. So why is it that our churches today so often are politically domesticated and timid, afraid to speak out on issues of justice? At the brow of the Mount of Olives is a magnificent view of the city across the Kedron Valley. It was said that when ancient pilgrims came to Jerusalem and saw the gleaming white city, they would cry for joy. But instead, Luke's Jesus cries out in pain and sorrow, as the mood of the narrative abruptly changes from messianic celebrating to a lamentation over the city on which Jesus now gazes, probably for the very first time in his life. This is a uniquely Lucan episode, and it reflects Jesus' bitter realization that his own people are doomed to be crushed by the very empire he is resisting nonviolently. This poignant moment actually continues a thread of lament that began in chapter 13, right after Jesus is warned that King Herod is out to get him. The long legacy of dissidents rejected by the capital city, named by Jesus here, is one that resonates deeply with our American experience. We too neither welcome nor comprehend prophetic faith. After all, we are reflecting on this gospel story tonight on the 55th anniversary of the martyrdom of Martin Luther King, killed by his own government, a matter I will return to in conclusion. Jesus will also come back to this lament a few chapters later in Luke 21, where he spells out in agonizing detail the Roman siege that would surround Jerusalem and result in its total destruction, as it did shortly after a nationalist insurrection in the year 70. Luke knew this as historical fact, but Jesus of Nazareth, with his keen political instincts, anticipated it 40 years earlier. And there's one more moment of lament in Jesus' response to weeping women on the Via Crucis, traditionally known as the 8th station of the cross. There, Jesus makes a plea to residents of the city to recognize the chickens coming home to roost for a system based on oppression. I wonder whether this might have been Jesus' last-ditch hope, namely that perhaps women would be able to turn their history around to avoid disaster, which was and is, by the way, the meaning of his call to repentance, to radically turn around the course of our personal and political lives. This narrative thread of lament shows that Jesus of Nazareth was neither a stoic ideologue nor a hard-hearted rabble-rouser only interested in tearing stuff down. No, Jesus embodied the tradition, his tradition of the weeping prophets, of Elijah and Jeremiah, who also lamented the destruction of Jerusalem in their times. True biblical prophecy is not about predicting the future in a crystal ball, but understanding the inevitable consequences of bad national behavior and speaking unpopular truths to those living in denial. The last part of our sequence is, of course, the famous temple cleansing. After the heart-wrenching moment of tears at the gates of the city, Luke simply says, "Then Jesus entered the temple." In fact, Luke's version of this notorious episode is the shortest of any of our four Gospels, a scant 2 verses. But the tightly woven series of episodes that we've looked at tonight draws intimate connections between Jesus' warning parable, his march of protest, his lament over his people's blindness, and his direct action to try to awaken their conscience in the sacred precinct that had been hijacked by the elites to concentrate the nation's wealth into their own hands. The dramatic temple episode has, of course, captured the imagination of many an activist over the years, not least, most recently, those in the Occupy movement of a decade ago, as this poster indicates, with a strong dose of snark. But we can rightly view this action as the most dramatic expression of nonviolent direct action in the New Testament. And in Luke, it culminates the theme of prophetic justice that has been unspooling since the beginning of the story. Clearly, our churches have a lot to learn about Jesus as a public actor, capable of both radical empathy and nonviolent militance. So we would do well to ask, why are such actions not also a part of our Palm Sunday or Holy Week commemorations? Whenever we march for justice, we're doing nothing more or less than following in the footsteps of Jesus. Fortunately, over the last half century, active Christians have been reclaiming this tradition of what 35 years ago, my dear colleague Bill Wiley-Kellerman called public liturgy. This is a classic book. If you're not familiar with it, check it out. And recently, a younger, hipper generation is rediscovering this way of recontextualizing scripture, such as last year's volume, The God Who Riots, Taking Back the Radical Jesus by Damon Garcia. So let me conclude by noting just a few experiences that I've had and you have had with Palm Sunday demonstrations for peace and justice in North America, in which Christians actually do take their faith out of the sanctuaries and into the streets. One of the early experiments in PUBG was the Nevada Desert Experience, their Sacred Peace Walk, a 65-mile annual pilgrimage to the Nevada National Security Site during Holy Week. Among others, I helped get the first one going when I was in seminary back in the 1980s with my old friend, the legendary Franciscan Father Louis Vitale, pictured at the top left. I've participated in this protest against nuclear weapons and in support of indigenous Shoshone sovereignty several times over the years, as perhaps have some of you. It is now an interfaith witness, and it is happening again this week as we speak. My partner Elaine and I helped get a Palm Sunday Peace Parade tradition going almost 20 years ago, birthed out of Pasadena Mennonite Church in response to the Second Gulf War. It involves a procession through the city and a public worship service in the business district. Friends in Australia march on Palm Sunday for refugee rights each year, as do our colleagues at Clergy and Laity United for Economic Justice here in California, who hold a public vigil at local INS detention centers in support of immigrant detainees during Holy Week. Again, coming up in just a few days. Catholic worker communities have been taking to the streets on Good Friday for decades. This week, we'll join our friends at the Los Angeles community who are teaming up with labor unions for a Solidarity Stations of the Cross downtown. And in this vein, I want to take a moment to acknowledge several people who are on this call tonight. Peter and Mary Sprunger-Fraze in Colorado, Ed Loring in Baltimore, Hetty Zawatsky in Niagara, Canada, Marcia Dunnigan up in the Pacific Northwest, all friends who have embraced this way of celebrating the memory of Holy Week in public space over the years. For over 30 years now, a group including the Sisters of St. Anne and Pax Christi have gathered at Boston State House to read Stations of the Cross of Nonviolence, which expose the many forms of social violence in our world. And as we were talking about earlier before we started, in 2015, the adorers of the blood of Christ learned that an energy company planned to build a pipeline on their land in Pennsylvania to the west of you, to the east of you. So these nuns started a resistance movement during Holy Week. And on Good Friday, 2021, the Columban Formation community in Seoul participated in a public Holy Friday liturgy organized by the Korean branch of the Global Catholic Climate Movement. They spread out to 14 Stations of the Cross at various places in the business heart of the city, with the final one coming at the steps of Myeongdong Cathedral. So I invite you to Google it yourselves. There are now so many places of public liturgy addressing so many social justice themes that they have become too numerous to mention. And that, friends, is gospel progress. Two traditions in particular deserve special mention in conclusion. One is the annual Holy Week protest marches by friends who today are still trying to find justice in Palestine, on the very streets that Jesus walked 2 millennia ago. A decade past, I had the privilege of being part of 2 Palm Sunday weekend demonstrations. On Friday, which was Land Day that year, traditional time of Palestinian protest, we were in East Jerusalem as mosque prayers led out. There was a dramatic clash between Palestinian protesters and Israeli police that went on for hours, with concussion grenades, charging horses, water cannons, and scores of Palestinians being arrested or carried away on stretchers. This included Omar Harami, staff for the Sabeel Center for Liberation Theology in Jerusalem, who was standing between the police and several older women who were sitting holding pictures of their slain sons. That's Omar on the bottom right. We later had to bail him out of jail. 2 days later, we marched from Gethsemane toward the Old City as part of the annual Palm Sunday parade from the Mount of Olives, just like the old story. There was something deeply moving about the waves of Christians of all types, ages, and countries joyously parading up and into the Old City. On this one day, Palestinian Christians can march proudly en masse and say, "We are not going away. This is our city and our country too." The other venerable tradition of public liturgy is the one on which I'll conclude my comments, because just as Palestinian Christians today are protesting in the footsteps of Jesus, we American Christians are marching in the way made by our greatest American prophet, Martin Luther King Jr. Interestingly, on Palm Sunday, 1959, Dr. King preached a watershed sermon at Dexter Avenue Church on why the church needs to embrace the nonviolent direct action politics of Gandhi. Then, just a few weeks before Palm Sunday, 1965, King launched his most famous march from Selma to Montgomery, today considered by many to be the political and emotional peak of the modern civil rights movement. It began with the merciless police violence of Bloody Sunday, March 7th, but was completed by some 25,000 marchers on March 21st. Later, on Holy Saturday, 1965, Dr. King participated in his first public anti-war march in Chicago, bringing down on himself the wrath of President Lyndon Johnson, not to mention his own SCLC lieutenants, all of whom wanted King to stay focused on his civil rights agenda and not muddle in foreign policy issues. 10 days after he preached his most consequential sermon, entitled Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break the Silence, at Riverside Church in New York, in which he famously diagnosed America as captive to the giant triplets of militarism, racism, and materialism. Talk about intersectional. Exactly 1 year later, almost to the hour, he was assassinated by his own government. After a lifetime of protest marches and of speaking truth to power in apartheid America, Dr. King was killed just 3 days shy of Palm Sunday, 1968, 55 years ago, this very day. Let us take a moment of silent commemoration. Lord, have mercy. Christ, have mercy. Lord, have mercy. 3 days after that shooting, on Palm Sunday, 1968, President Johnson declared a day of national mourning while Dr. King's body lay in state at Spelman College in Atlanta. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? The next day, Coretta Scott King led a silent march through Memphis. And the sanitation workers, strikers, whose cause had brought Dr. King to Memphis in solidarity, finally won their demands with the city after months of struggle. So now we can answer our original query. What happened after Palm Sunday? Jesus was cut down in part because of that brash public demonstration a few days earlier. But he rose up so the movement could continue in us. Dr. King followed that way, and so can we. If our churches can animate the courage and conviction to move from the sanctuary into the streets, and to realize that our faith is not only private, but consequentially public. In our North American churches, the things that make for peace are mostly still unrecognized, as Jesus put it in his lament over Jerusalem. So Jesus continues to weep. However, if and when we Christians can reconnect with the roots of our tradition, especially those radical gospel narratives, stripped of pious sentimentality and restored to the real world, then and now, we can move from exegesis to engagement, from our sanctuaries into the streets, and from proclamation to prophetic action, in order to witness to God's liberating vision of justice and beloved community. So friends, may such public liturgies spread across our land this Holy Week and beyond. Thanks, and let's open it up for conversation.
Sure. So we have a question from Kevin Hayes to ask if Ched could please share thoughts on how prophetic activities during Holy Week might also be done in a way that calls us and others to reconciliation.
Thanks, Kevin. There's a lot of sentimental discourse about what reconciliation means, particularly in our country, particularly from churches. And so let's not assume that we know what we mean by reconciliation. Does reconciliation mean that we of race and class and gender privilege offer ritual apologies and get on with it? Is it something where we imagine that if we all join hands and sing "We Are the World," that things will be better? Of course not. But what does reconciliation actually mean? In 2 Corinthians 5 and 6, the Apostle Paul gives his most extensive excursus on the nature of reconciliation. In Greek, katalagete, it's an imperative, be ye reconciled. The word in Greek means to restore equity. In antiquity, katalasso, the verb was used similar to how we use it today in terms of balancing a checkbook, bringing equity in a world way out of balance. So reconciliation has, in that sense, little to do with how we feel in our hearts toward one another, or trying to learn to be nice to each other. Those things are fine. But what divine reconciliation means is the restoration of equity. So I would strongly suggest that some of the most reconciling demonstrations that we've seen in our recent history in this country, say in the past 60 years, have been demonstrations that were at the time deeply controversial and upsetting to a lot of people. Certainly true of the Selma to Montgomery March, for example, and equally true of Black Lives Matter protests in the wake of George Floyd's public killing in 2021. So when we think of taking our liturgy to the streets, we as church have the language of reconciliation. It's right in our liturgy, and we must never let go of it. But we must also not sentimentalize it, but understand that embracing the call to reconcile is an embracing of the hard, long, intergenerational work of restoring equity to those who have been denied it, of rebalancing ourselves, not just personally, but also politically. And therefore, it would be my hope that works of reconciliation through public liturgy would not shy away from naming the inequities of the present. Let me give one example, and then we can keep going. Elaine and I had the great privilege of being in Canada. My wife Elaine is Canadian, and we were in Canada last summer when Pope Francis made his historic visit. And we followed it very closely. We have Indigenous friends who are also Catholic, who were part of the processions and those great public liturgies with gestures, just dramatic gestures of reconciliation. I don't know how much you all paid attention to that, but it was really extraordinary, in which the Pope publicly apologized for the genocidal Indian residential schools that was so fundamental to the personal and political destruction of Native culture, not just in Canada, but also very much here in the United States. The Carlisle School in Pennsylvania being one of the main sites of that. But in the aftermath of just really dramatic public embraces and encounters and liturgies, public open masses, last summer, the hard work for restoring equity begins to be the bona fide of the rhetoric of reconciliation. And I think the news of the last week, in which the Pope has for the first time spoken out publicly about the doctrine of discovery, which lie at the roots of modern colonization, that is part of that hard work of reconciliation, of trying to restore equity by going through and really looking at each major piece of injustice. So those are all, to me, expressions of the discipleship of reconciliation. Reconciliation is the way, is a way, and the result is equity, if that makes any sense. I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah, a follow-on question on that was about, where is love in your definition of reconciliation? Because equity is one thing, but that doesn't always equate, so to speak, with love. And God so loved the world that he sent his son. Where does that come into play?
Oh, well, no greater love, right, than the giving of one's own life. The giving of one's life is often not pretty. The execution of Jesus on a Roman stake was not a pretty sight. There was nothing romantic about it. There was nothing gentle about it. It was a public form of Roman terror and torture, to which Jesus went, and to which he went in large part as a result of his disruptive demonstrations on what we call Palm Sunday. So was the Palm Sunday march a loving march? I believe that it was. It was proclaiming love and justice, non-violently, but also very boldly. Jesus never turned anyone away from his movement. He invited all sorts of people to join that movement. He was loving in every utterance of justice, and he was had his eye on justice in every pronouncement of love. We Christians cannot separate love and justice, ever, not personally and not politically. So again, I just think I think we need to return to these Gospels and desentimentalize them, to understand that they were risky, they required courage, just as demonstrators throughout history have expressed love through courageous disruptive action. Was Rosa Parks refusing to sit at the back of the bus in 1955? Was that a loving act or a disruptive act? Well, obviously the answer is both. And we can go right down the line and look at what was the burning of draft files at Catonsville in 1968 a loving act or a disruptive act? I think it was both. Elizabeth McAllister, former nun, married to Philip Berrigan. Liz is still with us. She's our greatest living mentor. And she often told us the story about years and years and years after the draft board actions, when draft files were taken and burned or destroyed. She was checking into a flight to go someplace to give a talk, and the guy behind the counter looked at her ID and looked at her and said, "Are you the Liz McAllister, the one who participated in draft board raids?" And she said, "Yeah," and kind of braced herself, said, "Yeah." And he said, "You saved my life. My draft file was one of the ones destroyed in those actions. Thank you for your love." So again, friends, we need to understand that loving actions are possibly more often disruptive in the first instance, right? Before we make peace, achieve peace, sometimes we have to disrupt peace. And at least that's what the gospel narrative seems to suggest.
Thank you. So we have Sister Barb's hand up, and then we had two other questions. So Sister Barbara, what did you want to ask?
One thing I wanted to share with you, Chad, is that here in Pittsburgh for decades, we've had the public Way of the Cross, and this Good Friday, it'll be at 10 a.m. at St. James Church in Wilkinsburg to start. So I'm just inviting all around Pittsburgh to come and join us. But I wanted to ask you to expand on Jesus.
Barbara, just push pause there for a second.
Yeah.
Thank you for making that announcement to everyone. And I really hope all of you will try to be a part of that. But I want us to pause and say to ourselves, isn't it remarkable that these public stations of the cross that happen now in every city in this country by faithful Christians, they didn't exist 50 years ago. Nobody was doing that. And now it's become a tradition of social justice Christianity. I'm so pleased that it continues in Pittsburgh. This is a way in which the gospel is leavening our church again. And I just think sometimes we're so used to losing social justice battles, we forget that we are actually changing culture, and we're changing culture in the church. So I just wanted to commend this Wilkinsburg thing coming up and really encourage people to participate. Back to your question, Barbara. Thanks.
Yeah, Chad, I just wanted to invite you to share with us a little bit about Jesus' politics of building the kingdom, and how we can best encourage people to embrace that, because people not only do not do that in the streets, we do not do that in our churches as well, because many times our faith communities say, don't talk about racism, don't talk about war, don't talk about any of the issues in church. It doesn't belong in church. So how do we encourage people to understand the truth of Jesus' politics of building the kingdom?
Well, of course, that's the conundrum of the APP for 60 years is how do we animate and encourage these conversations to happen in church, and how do we then move out of the sanctuary into public spaces. It's obviously the APP and our work and the work of others on this call, our life work is trying to answer that question. How do we break the silences of our churches on questions that matter? Churches are too often bringing up the rear of social change as opposed to being on the vanguard. Or more accurately, there's always a few Christian folk, with or without collars, on the vanguard, with most people kind of waiting for the risky work of change to get done before we join. So there was a time, not too long ago in our lifetime, those of us who are over 60, where our churches were still largely segregated racially. And when people challenged that, as they did, both inside and sometimes on the doorsteps of the church and in the streets, they were excommunicated sometimes, they were called nasty names sometimes, they were shown the door, they were silenced. And here we are 60 years later, and no one in polite church in this country would say racial segregation is a good thing. I think we should segregate our church. No one would say that, right? Because what started out as what sounded like heresy, desegregation, became conventional wisdom. Now, that's not to say it's actually been embodied in our churches. We have a long way to go to become a genuinely multicultural church founded on economic, gender, social equity. But it's kind of an example how we undermine the witness of the gospel when we refuse to take risks and only come around when it has already become a majoritarian opinion. That couldn't possibly be the discipleship to which the Jesus of the Gospels calls us. Now, as I tried to say in this reflection, I know of no better source for challenging the church to rethink what it means to be political than the narratives of our Gospels. I believe we don't have to get a new story. We have to re-inhabit our ancient story, to do so with careful contextual work and with a keen eye toward the world we live in, and to try to make those analogies. So, my answer is, I guess, attempted to demonstrate in this reflection, maybe the place to start challenging some of the silences in our church, some of the resistances in our churches to being political, is to start with some Bible study, Bible studies like this one, because I think church folk are in some ways rightly wary of being part of some fad, or having somebody they don't necessarily trust come and say what they should or shouldn't do. We're not talking about here an outsider modeling to us what we should do. We're talking about the living persona that we call Lord. And so again, I think discipleship needs to be, our churches fundamentally need to move toward being places of discipleship, not places of religious entertainment, places of acting, not places of spectating. And I think we're making some progress, but it's not nearly the moral equivalent of the world that we are living in, is it? particularly around issues of gender violence, climate crisis, economic and social disparities. We just, and yet the other side of that is what better entity than our churches to build a popular movement in this country to actually make change. If the church didn't invent it, didn't exist, we'd have to reinvent it. Where else do we have a voluntarist organization that's deeply intergenerational, that has old wisdom traditions, that tells its own stories and sings its own songs and has community and practices mutual aid? We have so much to bring to the table of rebuilding a more humane society. To keep it all cordoned off into a privatistic spirituality, that just is perhaps the greatest tragedy of our current social moment. So Bible study, and then let's figure out how to put feet on that in our own world.
Yeah.
I know these ideas and these questions are part of your daily bread in the APP and have been for years. We're all in this together, trying to figure out ways to keep inviting and challenging and nurturing and giving permission to our people. But of course, the best way is to just invite people to come and see. So all of you planning on being out at Wilkinsburg on Friday, bring someone who's never done it before, and they'll see that, oh, wow, this wasn't dangerous and it wasn't crazy. This is actually a way to experience my faith. Because think about when your first public liturgy was and how the impact that it had on you. So come and see is always the best.
Come and
best
see.
strategy.
So I'd like to go to the question that Kurt asked, which was, what do you think we get right and wrong in our typical celebrations of Palm Sunday? If you could impress on all priests and pastors one thing about proclaiming the meaning of this celebration, what might that be? And bear in mind, we do have some priests on the phone with us tonight, so they're hearing directly from your perspectives and other reverends.
And in the interest of time, let's make this the last question, and maybe Chad, you can answer this question and tie it all up with closing remarks, if that would work. Okay.
Well, let me first say that it was Catholic priests who taught me how to go to the streets and find the gospel in public action. It is one of the greatest privileges of my life to have been mentored by people like Dan and Phil Berrigan, people like Louis Vitale, so I know that many priests have experimented and continue to experiment with these practices, and if you have concerns, questions about it, and we all do, know that you're not the first one to do it. We're all following Jesus and following other heroes of the faith throughout 2 millennia who have stepped out into the fray, vulnerably, courageously, with conviction. So I just want to give love and credit where credit is due. It actually, the Berrigan brothers and all their collaborators, Liz and so many others, kind of resurrected the notion of public liturgy when they used sacred symbols like blood and public prayer and sacred fire and enacting biblical prophecies like beating swords into plowshares. That is one of the notion of public liturgy has been a uniquely Catholic contribution to social change in the last 60 years. And it has animated and deepened and broadened the faith of countless people, Catholic and, like me, non-Catholic alike. What would I say is the best thing we can do to Palm Sunday, on Palm Sunday? I have two suggestions. One is, think about whether there's something other than palms you might use. Why? Palms are traditional. What would people do without palms? Well, people in the first century used palms because that was what was at hand, right? That's why they were waving them. What is at hand in your bioregion? What grows? What are branches of beautiful flowering plants or fragrant plants or native plants to your region that you could wave in a Palm Sunday procession? Why just go with the palms because somebody tells you to? Why not say the idea here is for regular people to use what is at hand to make a public demonstration. Here in our Southern California chaparral, we use sage branches. And I took one to the Palm Sunday church that I attended 2 days ago. It wasn't Catholic, but it was Episcopal, and they had their little palm crosses that everybody was wearing. And then I had my big fragrant sage branch, maybe a little disruptive. But to do that then invites people to say, why are we doing this? Like, why are we carrying branches? As opposed to just taking it for granted. That's what people do. And then ask something about what this means, that we would be rejoicing with creation in this processional. And then, of course, the second thing is take the procession out of church. I mean, way out of church, not into church. Most processions these days are an entrance, and it just kind of falls into the great processional tradition. I love processionals. Pomp and ecclesial circumstance can be very engaging. But ultimately, Jesus was processing not into a safe space, but into a very dangerous, conflicted, contested space. He was not doing a processional into a little cave where they could worship in secret. He wasn't going off to the River Jordan wilderness to be alone. He was going to face the powers. That is the tradition we are supposedly reenacting. So the question we have to ask is, what are the contested spaces in our parish? You don't have to look very far. Might be a local housing project. Might be where someone was killed by police. Might be where homeless folk are. But we're going into contested spaces with this proclamation of justice, God's and God's care. So those would be my two suggestions. Find a good native plant and get folk as they are able out into a meaningful place, because both those things, just changing what we're waving and changing the geography of where we're marching, will cause us necessarily to have to rethink everything about Palm Sunday. And I believe that will take us deeper into the gospel. And I think I've burned up all my time in that answer, so I'll turn it back to the beautiful people who have curated this thing. Special thanks to young Ethan for doing the magic behind the screen. Thanks very much again, John, for the opportunity to be with you all. And I very much hope that our paths cross, preferably at a Palm Sunday procession one day. Thanks very much.